Hello, and welcome to Dig a Podcast, a show that tells the in-depth story behind the songs of the greatest band that is, was, and ever will be, the Beatles. In this season, Season 1, we will explore the Beatles' first LP, Introducing the Beatles, or our UK listeners would know it as Please Please Me. Introducing the Beatles was originally scheduled for a July 1963 release, but came out on the 10th of January 1964 on VJ Records, whereas Please Please Me was released on the 23rd of March 1963 on EMI's Parlophone label. So let us continue with the next song on the album,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Love Me Do. There have been many songs recorded by the Beatles that have been viewed as hits or classics, but only a handful that can truly be viewed as legendary. Love Me Do surely falls into this category. This was the first song professionally recorded and released under the Beatles name, which excludes any Tom Sheridan and the Beat Brothers recordings. It was also the first Lennon-McCartney song, or indicated on the label, McCartney-Lennon, ever to be published and released. And it's the first song released in Britain with the complete Beatles lineup that we've come to know and love. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr. There are varied opinions about the song, even by the composers, but the one thing that's beyond debate is the vibrancy and originality of the track. Upon first hearing the song on the radio in the United States in May 1964, being that we were already acquainted with the Beatles' unique sound, we just viewed this as another great new contribution from the band. It was quite another picture in the UK. This was the first song heard of this new band by British radio listeners as a whole. Imagine what your impression would have been if this was the first song you ever heard by the Beatles. It might have been the same impression that Lennon's Aunt Mimi had when she first heard a demonstration disc of the song. She told John, "If you think you're going to make a fortune with that, you've got another thing coming." Nonetheless, the identifiable Beatle harmonies and simple but catchy lyrics make Love Me Do an irresistible favourite for lovers of oldies music. Hardly anyone at any age can keep themselves from singing along. And that is something that any inspiring songwriter only dreams of being able to create. Songwriting history. The writing of this great philosophical song, as Paul refers to it, takes us way back to 1958, as a 16-year-old McCartney writes the main structure of the song, the verses reportedly about his then-girlfriend, Iris Caldwell. He had already met John by then. July 6, 1957 was their first meeting, and it was generally believed that Lennon had a hand in putting together this early version of the song, which apparently only consisted of verses at this point. Paul recalls the song being written in the front parlour of his childhood home at Fourth Lynn Road, a 50-50 collaboration with John, either one dominating the authorship. Lennon, however, refers to Love Me Do as Paul's song, at least at this early stage. The lyrics they chose have a direct link with the love for the literary works of Lewis Carroll. The phrase "Love, love me do" is straight from Lewis Carroll era, such as "Alice stop daydreaming do." Lennon's obsession with Carroll continues to materialize throughout his Beatles songwriting career, such as in later works like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and I Am the Walrus. In Mark Lewisham's book, Tune In, the author suggests that the title Love Me Do may have been inspired from an Elvis film, Love Me Tender, in Liverpool in 1957, or from music press ads for a record actually called Love Me Do, released in Britain in February 1957. Lewishon admits that these influences are probably subliminal at most, but it still makes for interesting speculation. Back in 1958, the song was in the key of A major and played in a rhythm similar to the style of their then hero Buddy Holly. So we can speculate the verses were being performed by John and Paul on the back porch of Lennon's Men-Dipped home, with the tempo similar to Holly's Maybe Baby. Although Lennon and McCartney became very prolific as songwriters shortly after they met, filling a school exercise book with original songs they had written, their attention turned to perfecting cover songs they thought their audiences would enjoy once the popularity of the Beatles started to grow. However, when their manager Brian Epstein sent a telegram to the Beatles in Hamburg, Germany on May 9th, 1962, stating that they had secured a recording contract with them with EMI, including encouragements to rehearse new material, John and Paul took this to mean they needed to resume their songwriting. Considering Love Me Do as the best of their early songs, they decided to revamp the song in preparation for their June 6, 1962 recording session. Being that 4 years had passed since they originally composed Love Me Do, they decided to interject some of their more recent influences. They decided to lower the key to G major and slow the tempo somewhat to give it a more bluesy feel. McCartney is quoted as saying that the song was their attempt to do the blues, although it came out whiter because it always does. The blues sound of Arthur Alexander is incorporated, as well as the harmonica of artists like James Ray and Bruce Channel's recent hit Hey Baby. In 1963, John explained their revamping of Love Me Do to Melody Taker. It was just after Hey Baby came out. We were hoping to be the first British group to use harmonica on record. It was at this point that John apparently contributed the simple bridge to the song Someone to Love Somebody New, him stating in 1971, "I think I had something to do with the middle." Lennon's contribution to the writership at this point is undoubtedly the reason why Paul remembers Love Me Do as a 50-50 collaboration. Revamping the song meant rehearsals, these being done while still in Hamburg in their place of lodging whenever they had some spare time. Their current drummer, Pete Best, remembers a suggestion that he made for the arrangement. The idea was to make the middle eight different from the rest of the tune, and I said, okay, we put the skip beat in. Mark Lewishon's book Tune In explains. The skip beat was a fluctuation in tempo, an acceleration to lead into the vocal bridge and again later, before the instrumental middle eight. It was a strange idea, but must have sounded good enough in the moment for John and Paul to accept. Recording history. Session 1. The first actual recording of the song was at EMI Studio on June 6, 1962. The Beatles, with Pete Best, arrived at EMI and set up their instruments in Studio 3 for the 2-hour session, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The equipment they bought was not at all suitable for recording purposes. They had to strap up Lennon's amplifier to stop it from rattling, and had to do a soldering job on a tannoy speaker to convert it for McCartney to play through, since this amplifier couldn't be used at all. With this accomplished, things were then underway as the Beatles showed producer George Martin and Ron Richards what they could do. George Martin was not present at first, delegating pop recordings to producer Ron Richards. It was a standard practice for the producer to start off with what he felt was the most promising consideration for a single. Therefore, Ron Richards suggested they perform Besame Mucho, their rendition of the Coasters version, although senior producer George Martin reportedly thought the song was too corny. The band then went into the song, which they hoped would be chosen for the single, Love Me Do. Although the number of takes they did on this day is not known, more than one take had to have been performed. Tape operator Chris Neal recalls, all of a sudden there was this raunchy noise which struck a chord in our heads. It was Love Me Do. Norman Smith said to me, "Oi, go down and pick up George Martin from the canteen and see what he thinks of this." When George Martin arrived in the control room, he was attracted by something that they were doing. I picked up on Love Me Do mainly because of the harmonica sound. I loved raw harmonica, and I used to issue the records of Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. The harmonica John was using, by the way, was the chromatic model that he reportedly shoplifted in Arnhem, Holland, during their first trip to Hamburg, Germany. George Martin, however, started to make arrangement suggestions for the song. He noticed that John was singing the song's title solo during the climax of each verse, but then switched to harmonica before he could say the word do. Paul relates, George Martin said, "Wait a minute, there's a crossover there. Someone else has got to sing Love Me Do, because you're going to have a song called Love Me Wah. So Paul, will you sing Love Me Do?" God, I got the screaming heebie-jeebies. We were doing it live, and I was suddenly given this massive moment on our first thing, where everything stopped, no backing. The spotlight went to me, and I went, in trembling tones, "Love Me Do." I can still hear the shake in my voice when I listen to it today. It's interesting to note that the harmonica continued to play a major part in their early recordings. Their next two singles, Please Please Me and From Me to You, as well as other tracks recorded during their early days, featured the instrument as overdubs. After 1963, however, John rarely used the harmonica again, although the instrument did make a brief appearance in songs like I'm a Loser and even Rocky Raccoon. After the, as McCartney described it, nerve-wracking experience of having a professional producer rearrange your song for you, Martin decided he wasn't very impressed with the song after all. He reported hated the lyrics. He then asked them what else they had, and they did two other original songs that day, P.S. I Love You and Ask Me Why. Another thing that Martin was not impressed with was Pete Best. As they rehearsed in Hamburg back in May, Pete incorporated his skip beat into Love Me Do during the recordings. The awkward timing change was very noticeable, something we can all now hear since this recording was released on the compilation album Anthology 1. This is not to be evidence alone that Pete Best was not a talented drummer. One listen to the previous track, Besame Mucho, also available on Anthology 1, will show how impressive he could be. At any rate, what George Martin deduced from this day was that they needed to use a session drummer for the Beatles. This was the final nail in the coffin for Best, as they had been thinking of replacing him with Ringo for some time. Their next appointment in the studio would be without Pete Best. Concerning John's harmonica work on the song, he took advantage of being in company of Delbert McClinton, the harmonica player with George Channel, during the Beatles' appearance with them on June 21st. Lennon reportedly got a 50-minute lesson from McClinton on how to perform the Hey Baby harmonica riff in preparation for the group's next trip to the recording studio in September. Session 2. George Martin did not know anything about Pete Best being replaced when, on September 4th, 1962, the Beatles walked into the recording studio with Ringo Starr. George Harrison, in fact, came this day sporting a black eye that some sources say he received from being headbutted by Pete Best's fan at the Cavern Club. The 3-hour session, 7 to 10 p.m., was arranged precisely for recording both sides of their first single. Before the session started, though, there was a rehearsal session from 2:30 to 5:30 p.m. to determine which song would be recorded that evening. Martin had insisted that a song which he found for them, How Do You Do It, would be the A-side for the first single, which he had introduced to the Beatles beforehand by sending a demo recording of the song to Liverpool for them to learn. It was decided from the rehearsal session that Love Me Do would be the best candidate for the flip side. At some point during the evening of the recording session, which started at 7 p.m, John made it known to George Martin that, although they worked up what they felt was a suitable arrangement, they disliked How Do You Do It with a passion. The Beatles felt that they couldn't take that song back to Liverpool and that they'd be laughed at. Even though they felt the intimidation of being in the big-time recording studio, they stood their ground about wanting to record their own material. But Martin stood on stronger ground and insisted, saying that when they could write a better song than what he had chosen for them, he would let them release it on the A-side. So far as it was concerned, their original composition were suitable only for B-sides. So after 2 reluctant but spirited takes of How Do You Do It, George Martin considered the song complete and ready for mono mixing, which was done that evening. The next task at hand, starting at approximately 7:30 p.m, was to record the intended B-side Love Me Do, which became a much more laboured effort. This was a one-track recording, meaning mono only. George Martin decided to focus on rhythm track alone without vocals, which alone took 15 takes to perfect. Thereafter, a rhythm track was copied from one tape machine to another. John and Paul superimposed their voices. This also was a laboured effort which took an unknown number of attempts. It took much longer than expected to get this song recorded, George Martin having to extend the session well past the usual 10 p.m. ending time to 11:15 p.m. It's interesting to note that since the vocals ended up being superimposed later, Lennon could very well have sung lead on the song. In later years, there were instances where you could hear John's harmonica while he was singing, such as I'll Get You and I Should Have Known Better, as overdubbing progressively became standard practice in the studio. The best explanation is that since they already made the switch to McCartney singing lead back in June, they would stick to that plan. Some of the fans back home, including Johnny Gustafson, the bass player for the band The Big Three, protested to McCartney singing lead when the record was released, saying they liked Lennon's lead voice better, as they were already used to hearing it live. With Ringo being a relatively new member of the band, both McCartney and George Martin were reportedly not happy with his drumming on the song. Paul relates that after the session was over, John, Paul and George Harrison were told privately by Martin that he would like to do the session for Love Me Do It again with a hired session drummer. Although this was hard to accept, they relented, and another session was to be booked a week later. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, a mono mix was made of the song as well, although which take was deemed to be best is not known. Session 3. During the week-long interval between recording sessions, an interesting development took place. Music publisher Dick James did not like the rendition of How Do You Do It that the Beatles recorded and did not want it released on either side of their single, saving the song for someone else to record who could do the song justice. Also, music publishers Ardmore and Beechwood were poised for financial gain with any Lennon-McCartney songs that were released, so they were adding pressure for both sides of first Beatles songs to be original compositions. With all this in mind, George Martin relented to John Lennon's request for the Beatles to release their own songs. Therefore, with so much time invested in Love Me Do, it was decided that the recording of this song done on September the 4th, 1962, with Ringo on the drums, was the Beatles' first A-side. This being decided, their next recording session on September the 11th, 1962, in EMI Studio 2, 4:45 to 6:30 p.m. would be used to record the B-side of their first single. And since this was just to record the B-side, George Martin would let Ron Richards handle the production. Ringo was never told of their decision to hire a session drummer. Therefore, when the Beatles arrived in the studio on this day, apparently he was the only one surprised to see a session drummer, Andy White, there as well. At first, Ringo sat dejectedly in the control room with producer Ron Richards, thinking about how phony the record business was because of their not allowing him to play with this band. Richards then asked him to play maracas on the first song recorded that day, P.S. I Love You. There was apparently some more thought given to this song becoming the A-side, again relegating Love Me Do to the B-side. Ron Richards then realised that the title P.S. I Love You was already gracing a previously recorded song by Peggy Lee, so they squashed the idea of this title being the Beatles' first A-side. As an alternative for consideration for the B-side of the single, the Beatles then launched into the recording of Please Please Me with Andy White on the drums. This version now available on the compilation album Anthology 1. It nearly made the grade for being the B-side to Love Me Do, an acetate disc being cut as evidence of this. However, George Martin, who was then present in the studio, suggested they leave the song for another time because it was too good for the song to just throw away on a B-side. Then Ringo was shattered when he realised that this band was then asked to re-record Love Me Do with Andy White on drums. He felt they were doing a Pete Best on him, and that since he apparently was only good enough to play the drums at their performances, he might as well leave. Ringo reluctantly played on the tambourine and started at approximately 6 p.m. They went through 18 takes of the song, this time live in the studio, vocals and all. The last take, take 18, was deemed the best, and a mono mix was made at the end of the session. In the end, it was decided that the original version of Love Me Do, recorded on September the 4th, 1962, with Ringo on the drums, would indeed be an A-side for the first British single after all, with P.S. I Love You as the B-side. Ringo was quite happy about that. Stereo mixing. February 25th, 1963, George Martin assembled his team in Studio 1 at EMI to produce mono and stereo mixes for their first album, Please Please Me. The version of Love Me Do that would appear on the album, it was decided, was the Andy White version recorded on September 11th, so the mono mix made on that day was sufficient for the mono release of the album. However, the stereo version of the album needed a stereo mix, and the song was originally recorded on only one track, so a stereo version of the song needed to be mixed somehow from the mono mix done on September 11th. To remedy this situation, George Martin prepared a mock stereo version of the song by replacing the bass signals of the song on the one channel and the treble frequencies on the other channel. This process gives the listener a higher definition stereo feel, but without the separation of true stereo, as most of the other tracks on the album have. This mix is what appears on all of the stereo US versions of the song. Session 4. On May 30th, 1968, during the recording of the rhythm track for what became Revolution 1, Take 18 evolved into a long jam session that lasted over 10 minutes. During this jam, Paul was inspired to sing the verse from Love Me Do, which caught on an open microphone, which prompted Ringo to perform a Beatles break, similar to the original recording. This take was eventually released on the Super Deluxe 50th Anniversary edition of the White Album in 2018. Session 5. Interestingly enough, the last recording session that included this song was on January 28th, 1969. This occurred at Apple Studios at the then titled Get Back project was nearing completion. An impromptu edition of Love Me Do found its way onto tape, but because of the rough sound quality of the recording, it never materialized on any Beatles release. Session 6. On July 23, 1994, the three surviving Beatles met in George's private home studio at Frere Park at Henley-on-Thames, England, for a recording session that was filmed for possible inclusion in the anthology television special. They did a whole lot of rock and roll songs, television director Bob Smeaton relates, although the vast majority of the recording and film footage has never been released. A small snippet of the available footage shows what appears to be a newly recorded version of Love Me Do, although this has not been officially verified. One question remains, however, about the original 1962 recording of the song. Why was the first version of Love Me Do, with Ringo on the drums, replaced with the second version with Andy White on drums for all future releases in Britain and the rest of the world? The answer lies with George Martin. He apparently felt strongly enough about this matter to destroy the master tape of Ringo's version of the song as he was preparing the British EP The Beatles Hits, which was released in September of 1963. He wanted to ensure that the superior version, in his opinion, the Andy White version, would be the one to go down in history. Since the version with Ringo finally did resurface in 1980, his idea didn't quite go as planned. Official Beatle-related recordings of Love Me Do also included a session by Paul McCartney, sometime between September of 1987 and September of 1989, of a unique composition entitled P.S. Love Me Do. Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You were the only Lennon-McCartney songs in the entire catalogue owned by MPL Communications, Paul's music publishing company. This being the case, Paul combined both songs and, with his current band, created a rhythmic rendition which was recorded during the sessions for what would become his album Flowers in the Dirt. While the song did not appear on the general release of the album, it was among the many bonus tracks that did appear on the 1990 Japanese tour edition, which was entitled Special Package. A live recording of P.S. Love Me Do was made on April 21st, 1990 in Rio de Janeiro, the results appearing on his birthday EP released later that year. Also, sometime between February of 1997 and February of 1998, Ringo and his current studio band recorded a live version of Love Me Do for his 11th studio album Vertical Man, which was co-produced by Ringo and Mark Hudson. The song featured Aerosmith vocalist Steven Tyler on backing vocals and harmonica. A live recording of Ringo's version of the song was made as well on May 13th, 1998, and released on his album VH1 Storytellers. Thanks for listening to Dig a Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. This has been a Team Wilgo production. Until next time, if you know what I mean. Do I did? No? Okay.